Oakland, California, November 14, 1964, 11:22 p.m. The air inside the warehouse smelled of stale sweat, damp concrete, and cheap cigars. The heavy sliding door was bolted from the inside. No press, no fans, no lights other than a few flickering industrial bulbs hanging from the rafters. The rule was absolute. 3 minutes of sparring, no gloves, no second chances. What happened in that circle was never meant to leave the building. It was supposed to be a private lesson in humility for the little guy from Hong Kong. Instead, it became a secret that a professional heavyweight spent 20 years trying to forget. This is the story of the night. The world of boxing realized that mass has a breaking point. It started 6 days earlier with a laugh in a crowded gym. I have spent 30 years tracking down the men who were actually in that room. I don't deal in the cinematic magic of the silver screen. I deal in the physics of the human body under duress. I have interviewed the witnesses who are now old men with fading memories, but they all remember the sound of that night. It wasn't the sound of a fight. It was the sound of a demolition. Why would a man at the top of his game let a story like this stay buried? Because some truths are too dangerous for a reputation to survive. Everything began in a high-intensity boxing gym in the heart of the Bay Area. The atmosphere was thick with the rhythmic thud of heavy bags and the smell of wintergreen liniment. Joe Miller, known in the local circuit as Big Miller, was a specimen of traditional American power. He was a regional heavyweight contender with a chin like a granite slab and a right hand that could dent a locker. Miller stood 6'2" and weighed a solid 220 pounds. He was the embodiment of the Western pillar of combat: tuck the chin, stay behind the shoulder, and use mass to crush resistance. Bruce Lee was there as a guest, a 23-year-old kid who looked more like a philosophy student than a threat. He weighed barely 140 pounds. Bruce was demonstrating a series of rapid-fire strikes on a wooden dummy, his movements a blur of economy and speed. Miller stopped his own workout to watch. He didn't see a master. He saw a novelty act. He saw a man performing what he called choreography for children. Miller leaned against the ring ropes and let out a short, dry laugh that cut through the noise of the gym. He asked Bruce if those dancing moves actually worked against someone who could hit back. Bruce stopped. He didn't look annoyed. He looked clinical. He told Miller that his size was an asset until it became a prison. The room went silent. You could hear the steam hissing from the radiators. The challenge wasn't shouted. It was whispered. A private session was arranged. No ego, just data. But in the world of professional fighting, ego is the only currency that matters. The promoter, a man I'll call the Bridge, saw an opportunity to put the little guy in his place. He wanted to protect the integrity of his boxing stable. If a man like Bruce Lee could disrupt the hierarchy of power, the entire business model of the heavyweight division was at risk. The Bridge set the terms for the following Saturday night. He brought 2 of his most trusted sparring partners as witnesses. Bruce brought 2 of his students, men who were already beginning to see that the old ways of fighting were becoming obsolete. The rules were designed to favor the Titan. They marked a 10 by 10 square on the concrete floor with white tape. Leaving the square was an admission of total defeat. There was nowhere to run. The boxer was allowed full-force strikes. He was encouraged to end it quickly. Bruce, however, agreed to a handicap that seemed suicidal to the men watching. He promised he would never be more than 3 inches away from the boxer's face, yet he would never be hit. He also agreed to use only open palm stops to prevent permanent injury to Miller's career. He wasn't there to destroy a man's life. He was there to dismantle a philosophy. The silence pact was enforced. No coaching, no cheering, only the friction of feet on the floor. As the clock neared midnight, the warehouse felt like a tomb. Miller was bouncing on the balls of his feet, his massive shoulders rolling in a rhythmic warm-up. He looked like an engine idling at high RPMs. Bruce stood perfectly still in the center of the taped square. He wasn't bouncing. He wasn't shadowboxing. He was breathing through his diaphragm, his eyes locked on Miller's lead shoulder. To the witnesses, Bruce looked vulnerable, almost fragile, standing in the shadow of the giant. The promoter held a stopwatch. His thumb hovered over the button. He looked at Miller and nodded. He looked at Bruce, who didn't even blink. The watch clicked. The session began. For the first 10 seconds, nobody moved. Miller was waiting for the opening, the moment where he could plant his feet and deliver a shot that would end the experiment. Bruce remained a statue, his hands held low, defying every rule of boxing defense. He was inviting the attack. He was a vacuum waiting to be filled. Miller's patience snapped. He stepped forward with a professional-grade jab. a stiff, heavy punch designed to measure the distance. Bruce didn't move his head. He didn't move his feet. He simply tilted his torso 2 inches to the left. The glove grazed his ear, missing by a fraction of a centimeter. The wind of the punch ruffled Bruce's hair, but his expression never changed. It was the first sign that the math of this fight was not going to add up. Miller reset, his brow furrowing. He wasn't used to missing by such a small margin. He threw a double jab followed by a thudding right cross, the bread and butter of the heavyweight division. Bruce didn't retreat. He moved in. As the right cross reached its peak velocity, Bruce didn't block it with his forearm. He didn't duck under it. He extended a single finger and placed it firmly on Miller's lead bicep, right at the insertion point of the muscle. It was a touch so light it seemed accidental, but the effect was instantaneous. The kinetic energy of the heavyweight's punch didn't just stop, it collapsed inward. Miller's arm hung in the air for a split second, paralyzed by a neurological bypass he didn't understand. The punch lost all its payload. The ghost stop had occurred. The boxer froze. His arm felt like it had been hit by a low-voltage electrical current. He looked down at his own limb as if it no longer belonged to him. The witnesses in the shadows leaned forward. They had never seen a man's strength turned off like a light switch. The promoter's hand trembled slightly on the stopwatch. He realized in that moment that he wasn't watching a spar. He was watching a surgical dismantling of the human nervous system. But Miller was a professional. His shock quickly turned into a cold, hard desperation. He realized that his reach, his weight, and his power were being neutralized by something he couldn't see. He decided to stop boxing and start fighting. He lunged forward, abandoning the jab, and threw a wide, looping hook intended to take Bruce's head off the shoulders. It was a blow that would have ended most men's careers. And that was when the air in the room changed completely. That was when the mockery finally died, and the terror began to take its place. Miller's hook whistled through the air, a haymaker with enough centrifugal force to shatter a jaw, but Bruce wasn't where the punch landed. He didn't move backward to safety. He moved forward deeper into the danger zone. He stepped inside the arc of the punch, placing himself so close to Miller that their chests almost touched. This was the 3-inch rule in its most terrifying form. Bruce's head was tucked perfectly behind Miller's lead shoulder, using the boxer's own mass as a shield against the trailing hand. The hook missed Bruce's chin by the width of a cigarette paper. The kinetic energy of the miss sent Miller stumbling forward, his balance stripped away by the very power he had tried to exert. For a split second, the heavyweight was completely exposed. Bruce didn't capitalize with a flurry of flashy strikes. He simply placed his open palm against Miller's solar plexus and gave a short, sharp shove. It wasn't a hit. It was a redirection of Miller's own momentum. The giant staggered back 3 steps, his heels catching on the taped line of the square. He gasped. The air knocked out of him not by a blow but by the sheer suddenness of the encounter. The promoter, standing in the shadows, finally found his voice. "Stop dancing, Miller," he barked. "He's a flyweight. Put your hands on him." The skeptic's voice was the catalyst for the final escalation. In the promoter's mind, Bruce was simply being lucky, using footwork to evade the inevitable. He didn't see the mechanics. He didn't see that Bruce was reading Miller's intent before the muscles even contracted. Miller heard the command and his ego took the wheel. He wiped a bead of sweat from his eye and narrowed his gaze. His posture changed. The sparring was over. This was now a search-and-destroy mission. He lowered his center of gravity and began a relentless, disciplined march forward. He threw a series of short, choppy hooks, crowding Bruce against the imaginary wall of the square. The friction of their boots on the concrete sounded like sandpaper on wood. Squeak, thud, squeak. Bruce remained silent, his breathing rhythmic and deep, a stark contrast to Miller's ragged huffing. The boxer was throwing everything he had, decades of training, hundreds of rounds in the ring, the pride of the heavyweight division. But Bruce was always 2 inches away. Not 3, not 1, 2. It was a psychological torture. To be that close to a target, and yet unable to find the range, is a specific kind of hell for a professional fighter. Then came the moment that changed the room's temperature. Miller, desperate to land anything, lunged with a straight right that had his entire 220 pounds behind it. It was the all-or-nothing shot. Bruce didn't tilt away this time. He performed what he called an interception. As Miller's arm reached half extension, Bruce's lead hand shot out like a piston. He didn't hit the face, he hit the lead hip. It wasn't a punch in the traditional sense, it was a concentrated burst of kinetic energy delivered through the palm. I have spoken to the student who stood closest to that corner. He described a sound he had never heard in a gym before, a dull, vibrating thrum that seemed to echo in the rafters. The strike didn't knock Miller backward, it knocked him downward. The vibration traveled through the boxer's pelvic structure, short-circuiting the neural pathways to his legs. It was a total system failure. Miller's knees didn't just bend, they liquefied. The giant collapsed in a heap, his body folding as if the bones had suddenly turned to water. He didn't fall because of pain. He fell because his brain could no longer find his feet. He hit the concrete with a heavy, wet thud that made the industrial lights flicker. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody breathed. The promoter's stopwatch continued to tick, a tiny metallic heartbeat in the tomb of the warehouse. Miller lay on the floor, his eyes wide and unfocused, his hands clawing at the concrete as if trying to find a grip on reality. Bruce didn't celebrate. He didn't look down in triumph. He simply stepped back to the center of the square and waited. He was a technician who had finished an experiment. The data was gathered. After 10 seconds, Bruce reached down and offered his hand to the man who had mocked him 6 days earlier. Miller took it, his grip trembling. When the heavyweight finally stood, he wasn't the same man. The overconfidence was gone, replaced by a haunting, hollow look of someone who had just seen a ghost. The promoter moved quickly to the center of the ring, his face pale. He didn't congratulate Bruce. He didn't ask for a rematch. He looked at the two sparring partners, and his voice was a low, urgent hiss. "This never happened," he said. "You don't talk about this. Not to the press, not to the gym, not to your wives." The promoter knew exactly what he had just witnessed. If the world found out that a 140-pound philosopher could dismantle a top-tier heavyweight in 3 minutes without breaking a sweat, the industry was over. The myth of the big man was the foundation of the boxing business. And Bruce Lee had just burned that foundation to the ground. The group filed out of the warehouse into the cold California night. The heavy sliding door was bolted once again, sealing the secret inside the damp concrete walls. Miller left the sport 6 months later. He never spoke about that night publicly. The shame of being dominated by a man he could have theoretically crushed in his bare hands was too much to carry. The promoter kept his word, blackballing any mention of the encounter in the local papers. But the witnesses couldn't forget. They whispered in the back of gyms. They told the story to their students in hushed tones, years after Bruce had become a global icon. They realized that the night in Oakland wasn't about a fight between two men. It was the funeral of an old way of thinking. The world measures power by the size of the explosion, but that night proved that the real masters measure it by the precision of the fuse. Bruce didn't want the fame of the win. He didn't need the trophy. He used that night to refine what would eventually become Jeet Kune Do, the style of no style. He proved that size is an illusion that falls apart when faced with the science of structural collapse. In that dark warehouse, the heavyweight didn't lose to a fighter. He lost to a law of nature. As I look back at the testimonies I've gathered over 30 years, one detail always sticks with me. One of Bruce's students asked him later why he didn't finish the fight with a knockout blow to the chin. Bruce supposedly looked at him and said that the chin is a target for the ego. But the hip is where the truth lives. The world may still argue about who the greatest fighter was. They may look at the movies and the choreographed scenes and call it all a myth. But in a quiet corner of Oakland, there is an old warehouse that knows the truth. The math of that night didn't add up for the big man, and it never will. The secret stayed buried for decades because some truths are simply too heavy for a reputation to survive. The door stayed bolted, the lights stayed off, but the air in that room, it never smelled the same again. Because once you see a giant fall to a single touch, you can never go back to believing in the safety of your own size. The lesson was simple, clinical, and absolute. Precision will always find the crack in the armor of power, and that night, Bruce Lee was the sharpest blade in the room.